Well, thank you, Baroness, and good to see everybody. I was privileged to be here last year for the first ARC conference, and delighted to be here for this second one. I know I've got 13 minutes to talk to you about God, but I'm going to do it. There's been a lot of talk, and there will be more talk at this conference about economic development, political development, and so on. And I'm here as a bishop of the Catholic Church to speak to you about God, because my deep conviction is there can be no real political and economic development without some reference to the summum bonum, to the highest good. You can't tell the story of Western civilization without reference to God. My thesis is when God is bracketed, God is set aside or forgotten, societies tend to collapse in on themselves and they implode. If we want real progress, and not just a superficial one, we have to have reference to God. Now, I want to make the argument in brief compass by beginning with the structure of human consciousness, what the medievals would have called the soul. Now, the soul has a dynamism, the great medieval doctors said, a dynamism toward the infinite. Everything in us, spiritually speaking, is directed upward and outward toward the infinite. When that is frustrated, trouble ensues. I'll give you a great image for that. Look in Dante's Divine Comedy. Satan is not dwelling amidst flames. He's rather stuck in ice. In Dante's great image, Satan has these mighty wings. He was once an angel, and the wings are flapping because they're meant to fly, but he's stuck in the ice of his own self-regard and resentment. What's the result? The flapping of the wings over the ice just makes the environment of hell colder. Now, can I suggest to you, that's a terrific image for a culture that's collapsed in upon itself. Meant to fly upward and outward toward the infinite, but now stuck in the ice of its own self-regard. Now, I mentioned for the medievals, the soul has a dynamism. Look at it first in terms of the mind. Our minds seek the truth. They seek true things, and they find it. Think of the magnificent achievements of modern science. Think of all the achievements of philosophy. The mind seeks the truth. But it's satisfied only very briefly. Once it knows a particular truth, 10 more questions arise. And it seeks more and more and more. When it answers those 10 questions, 100 more questions arise. Thomas Aquinas referred to the mind as the intellectus agens, the active intellect, seeking more, more, more. Because finally, Aquinas argues, what the mind wants is not any particular truth or even a collectivity of particular truths. What the mind wants is truth itself. It wants the truth in its unconditioned form. Same thing with the will. The will seeks the good, and it finds it in great moral acts and great acts of justice. So we're talking a lot about politics and social arrangements. As we achieve particular acts of justice, the will is satisfied, briefly, because it wants more justice. It wants greater justice. It wants a higher good. And it seeks it and finds it and then wants more because finally the will is oriented not to a particular good, but to goodness itself. Same is true of the soul's desire for beauty, everybody. We want beauty, we seek it, we rejoice when we find it, we want to create it. And for a short time, the soul is satisfied by these achievements. But then it wants more beauty. Deeper beauty, higher beauty. Because finally what it wants is beauty in its unconditioned form, the beautiful itself. Go right back to ancient philosophy. Go back to Plato's Symposium and the great speech in that document by Diotima. And she says, look how we're beguiled by a beautiful face or a beautiful figure or person. But then she says, by this inevitable outward impulse, we seek higher and higher forms of beauty until, she says, finally, we turn to the open sea of the beautiful itself, That's Plato. You find the same thing in the Bible. Only in God will my soul be at rest. You find the same thing in St. Augustine. Lord, you've made us for yourself. Therefore, our heart is restless until it rests in you. That's the dynamism I'm talking about. It's an orientation of the soul, of our deepest spiritual energies, upward and outward toward God. Now, two things follow from this. I'm going to formulate one in a negative way, the second in a more positive way, especially in regard to our topic of government and society. Here's the first thing. When you have a keen sense of the infinite unconditioned good, a keen sense of unconditioned justice, a keen sense of God, then everything in this world, all of our accomplishments, are under God's judgment. They're under the criterion established by God. You know something extraordinary, everybody, in the Bible? Compare it here to almost any other ancient literature. There's a tendency in almost all the other ancient cultures to apatheicize the political, to turn political leaders and rulers into gods. Look, even in ancient Rome, Julius Caesar becomes Divus Caesar, the sacred Caesar. I'm from Chicago. I know Julius Caesar. He was a canny street politician, but he becomes deified after his death. Indeed, his adopted son becomes the son of the god. Then there's the Bible. The Bible does the opposite of apatheicizing political leaders. The Bible does the opposite of deifying political arrangements. Rather, with unrelenting moral clarity, it points out the flaws and failures of its political leaders. Think of all the rogues gallery of the kings of Israel, including the greatest king of Israel, David, who is frankly presented as a murderer and an adulterer. Everything and everybody is under the judgment of God. I think it's wonderful in my country, we have the Pledge of Allegiance, and it includes the line, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, some people think that little line, under God, that was inserted back in the 1950s, is just pious political boilerplate. It is the most essential statement of that pledge. It's true because if we're not a nation under God, then we become self-regarding, and we can tend to open the door to different forms of totalitarianism. Thank God that we're under God's judgment, lest we become politically dangerous. Okay? That's a more negative way to formulate the principle. Let me do it positively now. When you have a keen awareness of the infinite unconditioned good, it spurs you on to ever greater accomplishments of justice. It spurs you on to ever greater accomplishments of beauty, ever greater accomplishments of science and truth. Think of this holy longing for God as like the irritant in the oyster around which the pearl is created. Because we know that nothing in this world ever reaches to the unconditioned, we keep pressing upward, onward, more. If anyone here was educated by the Jesuits, you know about Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual principle that he called semper maior. Always greater, always greater, always more. What spurs us on to greater and greater acts of justice? Precisely our belief in God. Precisely a keen sense of God. You know, I just find rather fascinating. Look in our cultural history. Copernicus, Newton, Descartes, Aquinas, Bach, Mozart, Gandhi, Teresa of Calcutta, Dante, T.S. Eliot, Georges Lemaitre. People, you know, with achievements in all these different areas of human endeavor. What do they have in common? A very keen and lively sense of God, because it spurs you on upward. Let me give you a biblical image as I draw this to a close. First book of Kings, that great story of Elijah and the priests of Baal. Remember, they're up on Mount Carmel, and there's like a duel going on. Elijah says, erect altars to your gods, and you call upon them. I'll erect an altar to God, and we'll see who answers. And so the priests of Baal set up the altars, and they cajole, and they beg, and they dance, and there's no answer. No fire falls. And finally, at the limit of it, they begin to cut themselves and bleed as they dance around the altars, but no fire falls. What that is, everybody, is the biblical image of idolatry. When we make something in this world absolute, what happens is we turn in destructively upon ourselves. All the energies that are meant to press us outward toward the infinite are now turned against ourselves. The cutting and bleeding of the priests of Baal is a symbol of a culture caught in an idolatrous rhythm. Think of it as Dante's Satan stuck in the ice. When Elijah calls upon God and then the fire falls, it's not just my God's bigger than your God. It's talking about this principle. Don't make something worldly into God. Rather, unleash the powers of the Spirit upward and outward toward the true God. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Prague, and I was giving a paper there at the university. And I'd never been to Prague before. And I told the people, honestly, though I've lived in Paris, I've lived in Rome for part of my life, I've been all over Europe. I said, I think Prague is the most beautiful city I've seen in Europe. Czech, thank you. But I said to the people, what struck me was, and this is true in the painting and the sculpture, and especially the architecture, what's behind it but the Christian faith? What was animating all of this rich aesthetic production was precisely a keen sense of God. And they told me again and again when I was there, the faith has been knocked out of the people by communism. That even the grandparents of young kids today don't have the faith. And what's happened, of course, is a tremendous drying up of the cultural aesthetic energies of the people. I'm not surprised. Unleash the human spirit, and you do it in relation to God. Don't believe the modern lie that somehow belief in God chains the spirit. The opposite is true. It's belief in God. It's belief in God that unleashes the Spirit. Last image for you. 1979, John Paul II goes to Warsaw. It was the height of the struggle. They're worried about Soviet invasion and all of that. And John Paul in the great public square in front of 1 million people began simply talking about human rights and about human dignity and about grace and about redemption. And they say the people began to chant, "We want God, we want God. We want God." For 15 minutes, 1 million people chanting it. That's how the revolution that undermined the whole Soviet empire, that's how it began. So today, as I do a lot of work in evangelization, and yes, we know the statistics in the West about the decline of religion, and it's all true. I mean, we have to pay attention to all that. But what I see very much in my own work, especially in young people in the West, is that same cry. We want God, we want God, we want God. Because they're sensing that's the key, not only to their personal flourishing, but to the flourishing of our society. God bless you all. Thanks for listening today.